Okay. Well, thank you for coming. Thank you, my entire family online. Thank you for coming. People ask me where I got the idea for the story, and it came from this book right here. It's called The Circus Ship. It's a wonderful children's book by main author Chris Van Dusen. My children had this as, when they were little, and it's a wonderful story about a circus or a ship that's carrying a circus, and it wrecks off the coast of Maine, and all the animals go to the island, and they live among people, and it's just this wonderful, beautifully illustrated book. But at the end, the author says, yeah, this is based on a true story about the Royal Tar, which was a ship that was carrying a circus. And it didn't end as well. So this is the good kid's story, very sweet and kind. Mine is the true story. And as we can tell from the title, the wreck of the circus ship Royal Tar, tragedy in Penobscot Bay, you already know the ending, right? It doesn't end well. So buckle up. This is not a feel-good story, but there's a lot of hope in it as well, I think. So the way I like to start is with this quote from the man who was running the circus that was aboard the Royal Tar. And he said, nearly all those who perished were strangers in a strange land, far from their home and kindred. So I like to think that he was not only talking about the people on board, because many of them were immigrants from Ireland and England, but he was also talking about the animals that were in a circus. So all of these different groups of people and animals from around the world came together in this one horrific disaster in Penobscot Bay, Maine in 1836. So to start, this is a story about a boat. And if you guys were here, you get a ticket to the boat, but you only get a ticket if you're actually here. So the Royal Tar was built in 1836 on the docks outside of St. John, New Brunswick, out of Canadian wood. We've got oaks, we've got maples, things like this in the Canadian forests. And it was built, like I said, 1836. It was quite the revolutionary boat for the time. This is not the Royal Tar, but it's a picture very similar to what the Royal Tar would have looked like. She was a side wheel steamer, so she had a paddle wheel. It also had
Getting kind of a glare, so maybe I'll cut off one of the lights or something, so that, or it's actually more visible, but
no problem.
yeah, maybe I'll look at it.
No problem.
See if that makes sense.
There were also 2 masts on board. So if the captain decided that the weather was good and he should put up the mast, they could power under sail, he could do that. If the weather wasn't that good, he would heat up the boiler, which would burn turn the water to steam and drive the paddle wheels. Very revolutionary at the time. Steam power in 1836 was just starting to become more commonplace. The Royal Tar was built to be like a ferry boat up and down from Canada down to Maine. So there was no reason to go long distances. So this was just a ferry boat up and down. This is a typical boiler that would have been in a boat like the Royal Tar. Our boat was fueled by wood. Coal was really not a thing to carry around at that point in time. And because the boat was designed to go up and down the coast, there was no need, they could get wood at every stop. There was no need to carry a bunch of wood, or a bunch of coal. So this was the boiler, it was below deck. And men would fill that, they were the firemen, that would fill the boiler with wood. Now, I understand it's a little blurry and I apologize, but this is the most important safety mechanism on the boiler. This is the boiler gauge. And what that does is that tells you if the water in the boiler is too low. You don't want the water in the boiler to get too low, because then you're gonna have this really big hunk of hot metal down below deck. It's not like it was somebody's specific job to watch the boiler gauge all the time, but you gotta figure the guys down below, the firemen working down below deck, probably walk by 12 times a day and would check on the boiler gauge out of the corner of their eye. So, as I said, it was built in the docks outside of St. John, New Brunswick. This is a map of St. John. In 1836, in June, it went on its maiden voyage. She went on her maiden voyage from this dock right here down to that island, which is called Partridge Island. That maiden voyage took about 15 minutes. So this is a view from the dock. I went to St. John, I stood on the dock. That right out there is Partridge Island. Her maiden voyage was 15 minutes. And once it got out there, they said the celebrations went on for hours. Champagne flowed, sherry flowed. It was a big deal. People were very, very excited on this maiden voyage. And then she came back. They turned her around and came back to the dock. And then she went on her very first real trip in, again, June of 1836. Went from St. John down to Eastport, Maine, and Eastport back to St. John. She set records, and it took about 5 hours to go from Eastport back up to St. John. This was huge. This was such a fast boat, all right? If you did that trip over land, it would take you weeks. And sea travel was very dangerous at the time. Every newspaper I picked up talked about shipwrecks and fires and, rocks and people dying or just wrecking. But if you were a little bit adventurous, you would take that boat from St. John to Eastport, cut weeks out of your travel. So the Royal Tar was setting records already. One of the cool things was I started to find every newspaper I looked in, they had ads for our boat. I call it my boat tonight and give it to you because our boat tonight. The Royal Tar advertised in all the newspapers. So if you wanted to get from Boston to Portland, not Boston, Portland to St. John, it would cost you $8.
Sorry, we still have a glare. Maybe
whatever we need to do.
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking if I turn off all the lights, it will be really dark, but at least you'll have lights with that, maybe.
Yeah, okay. So $8 would get you a first class ticket, which is what you've got, this first class ticket. You get the deluxe accommodations above board, up on the deck. There were fancy staterooms, fancy meals. It was a luxury liner at the time. If you did not have $8 for this one-way trip, you could get a ticket for the steerage down below, and that was about $3 to $5. So it was a little more affordable. Now, the owners, Hammond, McLaughlin, and the Kay brothers, they said, this is the safest ship on the sea. And we never ever heard that again, right? We've never heard that proclamation. But that's what they said in June of 1836. The Royal Tar is the safest ship on the sea. And it was arguably. They followed all of the standard safety measures that were in place at the time. But keeping in mind that this was 1836, there were no regulations on how many people could be on board. The first maiden voyage that I took there that went down to Eastport, there was about 200 people. There was no capacity, right? No rules on that. There were no regulations on how many lifeboats you could have on board. It's believed that the Royal Tar, under sail most of the time, had 4 lifeboats on. Also, there was nothing known as personal flotation devices at the time. There were no life jackets. So by our standards today, yeah, it wasn't that safe. But by their standards, it absolutely was. Now, another noteworthy thing is that the owners did not take out boat insurance. It wasn't that big of a thing back then, but they could have. But keep in mind, they just launched the boat in June. And so it's quite possible they were giving it a year, try to figure out how things go, and then they get the boat insurance. Just an aside, keep that in the back of your mind for a little while. So that's our boat. We now have this boat. It's luxurious, it's fast, it's got all the latest technology, it's ready to roll. This is also a story about people. I want to set the scene for us a little bit. It's the 1830s. There was a cholera epidemic in the United States and Canada in 1832. This is 1836, but it's still sort of hanging around. That was due to overcrowding, which a lot had to do with the fact that there were so many immigrants coming into the country in both Canada and the United States. There was an anti-slavery movement that was very strong in the cities, which has nothing to do with our story, but I thought that was very interesting. Patriotism and education were growing in the United States and Eastern Canada. This is the typical dress of a woman. This might have been a woman who was had a little more money, but this is sort of what any woman at that time would wear. We're talking long dresses, woolen petticoats underneath. This whole dress was probably made out of wool. Last time they would wear shawls. I just wanted to point out what these women typically wore. Now, the subject of our book happened in October. So she definitely would have been wearing a shawl at the time. I couldn't find a picture of the average man in 1836, but these are the fancy men in 1836. But you'll know heavy boots, probably woolen pants, this long woolen overcoat, and don't forget your top hat. So these are the sort of clothes that the passengers on the World Tar would have been wearing. They advertised immigrants as well, right? We had the first class passengers being advertised, but they also targeted the immigrants, $5, it says, or to Portland for $3. So $3, that gets you a spot down below where there were bunk beds. And whole families would be down there and they would cook dinner together. It was about a 3-day trip from St. John down to Portland. So they would leave St. John, about 5 hours later, they'd be down in Eastport, and then they'd make their way down to Portland in about 3 days total. So they really targeted the immigrants. St. John was a place where a lot of boats from Ireland came over, and people hung out in St. John for a while, got some work, but then they started to head back down to the States to join their families, like in Boston or in New York City. So one of the cool things I found were these passenger manifests. So these are, when you came into St. John on a boat from Ireland, it was like coming to Ellis Island, you had to register and you wrote your name and your age and what boat you were on and your occupation and where you were from. I was able to take these records that were actually legible and compare them to our passenger manifest of the World Tar on that fateful journey in October of 1836. So I was able to find some of our passengers. Now, am I 100% sure that the Mary O'Brien that was on this list is the same Mary O'Brien that is on the World Tar? No. But I'm very confident that her story is probably pretty similar, even if it's not the same one. So I hope you will give me that latitude there. Oops, wrong way. So I wanted to go over some of our passengers. All right. We've got Marguerite Cochran. And again, these are people that I matched up to the different manifests. She was 20 years old from Londonderry, Ireland, and her occupation was spinster. That just sort of, by our standards, like really a 20-year-old is a spinster. That seems like not really different than a woman, much better. But unfortunately, her name isn't red, and she did not survive the sinking of the World Tar. We've got Thomas Mahoney from Kinsale, Ireland. His occupation was seaman, and the reason I put that in there is because it's important for us to keep in mind that there were experienced seamen on the boat, on World Tar, on that last voyage. He wasn't working for the World Tar, but he did have experience. We've got Dennis O'Brien, a laborer. John Hogan and his wife Mary were both on the boat. Oh, did I skip one? I'm sorry. another laborer, another seaman, Patrick Moore. I like Patrick Moore. He was 18 years old. He was from County Kildare, and his occupation was gentleman. All right, so I had two 18-year-old gentlemen in my house at one point in time, and I don't know if I would have termed them gentlemen as an occupation, but just a different time. Just wanted to point that out. Our captain was Captain Thomas Reed. He is a native of St. John. He was 46 years old. He was the first and only captain of the Royal Tar. He had 6 kids and he was married to Frances. And we're going to talk a lot more about Captain Reed. So another couple of interesting people. We've got W.H. Harrison. He was 24. I want to show you a map. He spent the summer working outside of St. John. He worked hard all summer and he's like, I'm going to go to Ottawa to visit some buddies. So in 1836, it made more sense for him to hop on a boat and go down to Portland and then go overland to Ottawa than to go straight from St. John to Ottawa. It just was the way the roads were back then. It was just the most efficient way for him to get there. We're going to talk about Harrison some more. We've got J.T. Sherwood. He is our own very personal, magnificent Molly Brown, unsinkable Molly Brown. He was on his way to serve as British consul in Portland, and he had been on board a boat that had wrecked a couple of years before. So he's our experienced boat sinker guy. And then we've got Henry Fuller. He's the man who had the quote at the beginning, and he was our the overseer of our zoo, of our circus, and his occupation, of course, was circus. So those were the people that were on board the Royal Tar. There were a total of, we'll get to that, about 93 passengers on board, and those were some of them. The other thing that we had on board was traveling circus. And this is also a story about a traveling circus. Circuses were not like they are, like we think of them now. There was no big top, there were no acrobats, there was no fire eater. It was primarily an animal show. You may have had a few performers, and sometimes they would feed the animals as part of the entertainment, but these were animals in wagons that were transported from place to place, and they would set up shop and hold their service. The star of our circus, in my mind, was an elephant named Mogul. Mogul arrived in the United States in May of 1931. So he stepped foot in Boston along with a rhinoceros. It was somewhere down in the seaport of Boston, and they split up the elephant and the rhino, and he was shown at what's the word, Lion Tavern in Boston, which is no longer there, but someplace around Newbury Street. I know this is our elephant because there is a website called elephants.com, circuselephants.com or something that traced out all the circus elephants that came to America. Wow. And this is our guy. This is our elephant. It was so cool to find that out. So Mogul was an amazing elephant. He was so cool. So he had a lot of personality. They told a story about how one night his normal handler, because all the animals have handlers, his normal handler had been out for the evening, and he had this substitute handler taking care of him. And the real handler came back at night and probably was a little tipsy, probably been to the pub. They laid down in his bed in the barn, and all of a sudden he's lifted out of his bed by this elephant in his trunk. Mogul picks him up, takes him over to his feed bowl, because the substitute guy had forgotten to feed him. And so Mogul was not going to go to bed hungry. He stood there over his real handler until the guy filled his bowl with hay and potatoes, and everything was right with the world again. Mogul also had a thing for New England apples in the fall, and when they would go on their routes in the fall throughout New England, he was known to take the top rail of a fence off and then just step over it into the field and go pick as many apples as he wanted, then join the group again. He would have been put to work in the circus. He would have had to pull some of the wagons, but he definitely was a spectacle, and everybody loved that. Well, so there's circuses back then were genius. They really were. They marketed themselves as either a menagerie or a circus, depending on where they were. If they went to a New England town that was a little more conservative, that were afraid that circus was a little too unsavory, and that maybe wild people or pickpockets or something like that, they would simply call themselves a menagerie and present themselves as an educational tool. Bring your children, come see the animals of the world. This is our menagerie. Same exact group of people, same exact group of animals. If they went to a place that was a little more wild and a little less conservative, they called themselves what they were. They called themselves a circus. But it's sort of cool how they marketed themselves depending on where they were.
I was wondering why when I was reading
it was simply a tool to say, yeah, we're kind of educational. Same thing. So you would think, so at this time, in the 1800s, there were circuses all over the place. And so you might go to one and you'd see a monkey and a zebra, and you might go to one and see an elephant and a tiger. It was hard not to cross paths. So they wanted to set up some loose territory, just so people didn't impose on each other. And so the Zoological Institute was born. In 1835, they got together in New York, and all the zoo owners, all the circus owners, and they set out different routes. It was loosey-goosey. It really wasn't hard and fast, but it gave them territory to prevent the overlap. The problem, it didn't last very long. That it started in 1835, it did disband in 1837, but it was a good idea. These are some of the posters, and I understand it's hard to see, but they misidentify animals all the time. Like, come see the unicorn or the one-horned rhinoceros. they had a lot of trouble with South American animals, like the capybara and the puma. They would miss like black lion, puma, this, that, same animal, they just would call them different things. And so that kind of played into their little game too, because, you know, you're gonna give up a quarter to come see a puma here, but if you go to that one 3 towns over, you might see a black lion. It's the same thing, right? And they traded animals back and forth. But their knowledge of natural history was sort of lacking a little bit. But they were learning, it's all good. We also had a tiger on board the Royal Tar. He didn't have a name that I could find. And he has the most horrific story from when he was poached, when he was just a kitten or a pup. They tracked his mother for days through the woods and through the jungle and finally killed her and took the cubs. But this guy, he was a gentle giant. He was handled from the time he was a cub. And I guess they kept him engaged the whole time, obviously. But he really kind of started to make friends with a circus dog that was hanging around. He and his dog had this little friendship. The dog would hang out with him and stuff. So finally, they let the dog in the cage with the tiger. They thought that was a good idea. And I guess the tiger licked him and cuddled with him and all that stuff. Sort of like I think of like Lenny in Mice and Men. Yeah, the dog died just a couple weeks later. But our tiger was heartbroken. I guess roared and was just down for a long time since his buddy died. So these animals are they were just wonderful giant personalities. Yes, and there's Mogul with some elephants, or some apples. So another thing that would happen, we'll get to that in a second, but there was always a conflict between the circus and the locals, because this is a traveling circus. So we're in Brockton right now, and if you're trying to get to, is it Whitman? Yeah, if you're trying to get to Whitman, then if they're going to be in Whitman the next day, why would you pay a quarter to see them if you just stand on the road and watch them pass by, right? Quarter for an adult, 12.5 cents for kids. So hopefully you got 2 kids, so the math worked out. So the circuses were finding that people weren't paying to see their animals, but they were lining the streets because they knew where they were going to be next. So the circus said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to travel at night, so the people can't see us. Well, that worked for a little while until people started to realize what's happening. And what they did is the locals went out, they set up bales of hay along the road, along the route. They set out horsemen out first when they saw the circus about ready to leave, and the horsemen would drive down the road yelling out, saying, you know, the circus is coming, and they would light the bales of hay, which would illuminate the road as the circus went down. Circus didn't like that either. So what they did is they sent their own horsemen out. And the locals lit the hay, and the circus would wait a little while, and then march in the dark past these smoldering piles of hay as they went along. So it was sort of a constant battle back and forth between them, but it was really entertainment. This was a way to show your children the world by just paying a quarter. And this is 1836, which is a time of prosperity when people had an extra quarter in their pockets to spend on this. So these circuses, our circus, Fuller's Menagerie, it left Boston and then traveled all over Maine and into Canada. And I don't know its exact route, I did look, but I do know that they ended up in Yarmouth at the end of the middle of August, 1836, because they placed an ad in the newspaper saying, we're looking for a suitable vessel to take a circus all the way to New York City, August 19th, 1836. So they're in Yarmouth, they want to get to New York. So they wait a little while and nobody's answering their ad. There's no boat saying, yeah, we'll take the New York City Circus. Finally, in September or October, Captain Reed says, all right, I'll take you as far as Portland. So the circus had to make their way from Yarmouth to St. John, because Captain Reed said they would take it on the Royal Tar, to take it as far as Portland. So that's what we've got. We have the boat. The Royal Tar is making trips up and down the East Coast, right? From St. John to Eastport to Portland and back once a week, back and forth. We've got the passengers, whether they're locals or whether or not they just arrived from Ireland. We've got the circus, and they're all converging at once on St. John in October of 1836. So the circuses were, a lot of the animals were in omnibuses, these big heavy wagons that were going to be pulled by either Mogul, or there were 3 horses on board, there were a couple of camels. So some of the animals had to work and pull the omnibuses. Not only did our circus have animals, it also was carrying a bird exhibit. There were serpents and snakes, and there was a brass band, and there was a waxwork museum, like Madame Tussauds. So, you know, like if you got an animal, you might as well join the circus, right? Because who didn't want to join the circus back then? And one of the good things about joining the circus as a young runaway or whatever, is you had a job and you had a family, right? And you had food. You didn't get paid as you went along, but you got paid at the end of the season, depending on how well you did, how well the circus did for the season, but you got food and lodging. And so it was a community. It was a safe place to be if you were going to run away. So Captain Reed said, you know, yeah, we'll take your circus, but they had to prep the Royal Tar for that because that was not set up to carry a circus. Because it was estimated they were going to have 72 passengers, 21 crew, and the circus on board. So to make room for all those omnibuses and all the animals, they made the decision to leave 2 of the lifeboats back at St. John. Again, never ever can you hear this. So now we have two lifeboats on board. They also had to, they decided, all the caged animals, there were 2 lionesses, there's our tiger, the snakes and stuff were put down below deck. They put the horses and the camels and mobile up on top deck. But they had to make sure that they had appropriate sort of bracing to put an elephant on deck. So they spent some time bracing the flooring from below, they put in some bracing, and they had decided they put mobile right over the boiler. Maybe keep it warm or something, I'm not sure. But so they spent some time putting the extra bracing around the boiler. The circus got to town, and this right here, I went to St. John as I was researching this book, and this is a park up on top of the hill. Princess Charlotte Street is right here. But this park is where they gave their last performance on the night of October 20th, 1836. So Fuller got all their people together, all the wagons and the elephant and the tiger are here, and the people of St. John come out to see the last performance. You gotta figure it was probably a pretty good one, right? Like they're all into it. Everybody knows this is their last performance for the season. The workers are pretty sure they're gonna get paid after this, and so they probably put on a heck of a show. So this is so Fuller paid all his men that night, and he paid them in specie, which is coins. There wasn't dollars or paper money back then. So all those men, all the servicemen got paid that night and had all the coins in their pockets. And probably hit a pub or 2 in St. John, but other than that, they had all that money with them to take back to their families. The next morning, they were to leave from Peter's Wharf. Now, that park they were just at is up behind that building. And one thing I didn't realize when I before I went to St. John is it's hilly. Like I didn't know it's hilly. So apparently Mobile had a really unique way of walking down hills. So, all the people again lined the streets of St. John to watch this whole circus go down the hill to Peter's Wharf. And Mobile, apparently when he walked down a hill, he was a little unstable, he would tuck his hind legs behind him and sort of scoot down on his butt.
Oh my God, that's hilarious.
So the people got that show, right?
As the seats on that big.
As you're watching this elephant make his way down the street. This is the pier from which they left. This is what it looks like today. They have great fish tacos there, by the way. This is what it looks like in 1900. It probably didn't change much. So this is kind of what we can think it looked like in 1836. But you can see there's a lot of similarities. But this is where the Royal Tower left from. So there we are. Peter's Wharf, St. John, New Brunswick, Friday, October 21st, 1836. Many people said it's like Noah's Ark, right? You've got the brass band was playing, you've got the elephant scooting around in his butt, you've got lions roaring. It was quite the spectacle. Harrison, that's the kid that was on his way to Ottawa. I remember there were a number of horses, a large elephant, a number of wild animals and birds, and a large exhibit of waxwork. So if anybody knows anything about maritime lore, Scott, right on board, boats should never have gone off. All right, it's bad luck, or it was back then, to travel with women on board a boat. I guess it's too tempting for the men. Dozens of women and young girls were on board that day. So lucky to leave on a Friday. They didn't usually, the Royal Tower usually left on a Wednesday, but they delayed it so they could retrofit the boat to make room for the circus. And it's unlucky to whistle or have wind instruments on a boat because I guess you're making Neptune out of the sea upset. There was a brass band on the boat that day. So perhaps this was not the best voyage to go on.
Neptune just not like the competition.
Yeah, exactly. Neptune does not like competition. So we were going from St. John to Eastport to Portland, and it should have taken about 3 days. They leave St. John and immediately get socked in by bad weather. The winds picked up, it starts raining. Remember, this is the time before GPS. This is the time before any sort of weather prediction other than, looking at the sky and whether or not Captain Reed's being or something.
Yeah.
But he decides we'll just go to Eastport and hunker down there for a couple days. And that's what they did. They ended up staying 3 days in Eastport. They were supposed to be 3 days all the way down to Portland. So can you imagine conditions on the boat? You've got animals on board. It's choppy, and even though they were protected in the harbor, it was a storm. It was stormy. So you've got all these animals, all these stinks. You've got all these people that had enough food for a 3-day voyage, and now they're using up all their food. They're stuck down below with lions and snakes and stuff. But I guess people's spirits were pretty good. And finally, Captain Reed's like, all right, we're gonna do this. So I found a letter that this woman wrote in 1812. So she was just a little tiny girl in 1836. But she remembers in Eastport, her dad in a rowboat took her and her brother out to watch the circus ship leave, and they finally left. And this woman said she saw this really kind of sophisticated older woman. She had diamonds in her hair, her hands, a scarf over her head, and she remembered the woman saying something about God as she was waving goodbye. The reason this is so memorable for Mrs. Small was that she later, when she read about the wreck, she realized that there were no elderly women that survived. So she remembered that woman. Wow. So here we are, Penobscot Bay, 1:30 p.m. October 25th. I just want to show you where we are. So we left Eastport, which is up here. They came down, and this is Penobscot Bay. Captain Reed decides to cut through here. This is the Fox Island thoroughfare. The weather's starting to get a little iffy again, so he was looking for the protection, I think, between North Haven and Vinyl Haven. So he pulls the boat into here, and they're still under sail. I want to point out, just in case anybody's interested, the waters in Penobscot Bay in October. 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay. Hypothermia sets in at 50-degree water, hypothermia sets in at 30 minutes, and you get death in 1 to 2 hours. The more you exert yourself by swimming or treading water, the lower that number goes. Losing heat. So I just want, someone had once asked me what the temperature was, so I wanted to throw that in there. So we're in Penobscot Bay, it's 1:30. Gave it away. And the young son of the head fireman down below deck notices that the boiler gauge is low. So this is 1:30, Captain Reed is on lunch break, and the second mate is in charge. So the dad of the young boy went and told the second mate and said, hey, you know, the boiler is low on water, and the second mate told him, he's like, I'm not gonna worry about that right now. So all of a sudden, the boiler is red hot, and it catches the bracing that they put there for mobile on fire. So now we have a fire in the middle of the boat. Finally, they alert Captain Reed, and he immediately calls for the anchor to be dropped because they want to try to pump water into the boiler to try to douse it. That doesn't work. So he calls for the anchor to be taken up, and he's like, put up the sails. We're gonna head for shore. Because if you look back at that map, they're not far from shore, right? They're here. It's only like a half a mile, so we can make a run for it with sails. Well, by now the fire is really raging, right in the center of the boat. As soon as he puts up the sails, they catch on fire. So they are adrift. No anchor, no sails, no boiler in Penobscot Bay, and the weather's getting bad. Started with rain, the wind's picking up, and they're just freely floating. But the passengers are alerted, and you can imagine the terror. You've got a fire in the center of the boat. People are on the bow and the stern, they're separated from their families. There are animals that are freaking out and crying and screaming. You've got passengers jumping overboard. You've got just complete chaos. People were jumping overboard, like I said. There was an account of a man, he had his trunk with all of his belongings in it. He jumped over the boat, sank like a rock and or something. People, those workers that had all their money in their pockets, they were jumping overboard and sinking because they were too heavy. Even if you could swim with that stuff, even if you're a woman in that long wool dress and you could swim, it would still be difficult for you to keep yourself afloat. Again, the chaos and the animals running around deck and the lions below, it must have been horrific. Captain Reed immediately takes command. He says, throw the wagons over, those omnibuses. They'll float in those poles and ropes, man the buckets, and get a chain on the elephant, hoist the distress flag, get that long boat overboard. So he did get a distress flag up. And he called for the boats to be put over. We've got a long boat and a small boat. Remember, we left two back behind in St. John. So they throw the boats overboard. 16 crew members get in that long boat and took off. Never came back.
Wow.
The passengers watched as the crew rowed away. Captain Reed took command of the little boat, and he said, I was captain of the big boat, and damn me if I will not be captain of the small one, and if any man refuses to run for the cutter, I'll throw him overboard. He took control. But there were 93 passengers. I keep needing to do the math ahead of time, and I don't. 93 passengers minus the 16 that took off, and he has one small boat. That's what he's got to deal with. Meanwhile, they are, you gotta figure the animals down below didn't have a chance. They pushed the horses over, because horses are good swimmers, but I guess they just panicked, and they circled the boat until they were exhausted. Same with the camels. Mogul was chained to the deck by one foot, and he was not right over the flames, but I don't know, he stood there and he was trumpeting, and he had his front legs up on the railing, but he didn't know what to do. People were jumping overboard. There are stories about people hanging from ropes on either end of the boat, and then they were holding up other people that were holding onto them. Some people got on rafts or like makeshift rafts and tried to float away. It was crazy. Captain Dyer in the detail. Someone saw the distress flag, or else saw this flaming boat in the middle of Penobscot Bay and came over from Castine, Maine. The problem with Captain Dyer's boat, it was carrying gunpowder. And he didn't want to get too close to that burning boat. So he could not come right up next to it. And he anchored a little bit or steered himself out a little bit away. So Captain Reed went back and forth, fearing his passengers, either plucking them from the water or plucking them off the boat, from the boat to the Vito. He saved 45 people that day.
Wow.
When I returned for another load of people, the steamer was a sheet of flame. It's interesting to me how long it took for the boat to completely burn. It was hours, but it kept going. It still was intense. So that we know what happened to the animals, right? The horses drowned, complete panic. Finally, Mogul decides to jump. He's been there long enough. The flames are getting close. He takes a leap over the railing. Unfortunately, he lands on a makeshift raft that some of the passengers had just assembled, laying right on top of him. The last anyone saw of Mogul, he had turned around apparently and was waving his trunk in the air to his handler, who was still on board, as if to signal, all right, come in the water, it's good. We're not done with the Mogul story.
You said he was chained to the deck.
He was chained, but he jumped.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for pointing that out. That's a good thing. He was just so desperate.
Yeah,
He had to get off.
yeah, I get it.
Fuller, our circus guy, I wound a rope around my neck and thigh and wasn't able to bear the additional weight of 3 men in the lead. He was holding on to 4 people. And so until Captain Reed get the boat over there to pick him off and everybody else. The rescues are pretty amazing and the things that people did. So finally, all the animals are off. There's no animals around. Anybody who could have been saved had been saved. Captain Reed and the passengers stood on the Vito and watched the World Harvest end. They said that there was a woman, perhaps it was that elderly woman that girl had seen, and on the bow of the boat, and they watched her, and then a sheet of flame came up and obscured their view, and when the flame went down, the woman was gone. And then the World Tar floated off a little bit further in Penobscot Bay. The Vito took the passengers to the Isle of Hope, which is nearby, and the residents there really took good care of them. They gave them feather beds and rabbit stew and warm clothing, and eventually they got on another boat and got to their destination. One of the things Captain Reed insisted on was that the owners of the boat pay for everybody's voyage to their final destination, which they did. Captain Reed was questioned in an inquiry after everything came out in the newspapers. It was all over the newspapers. Dreadful catastrophe, World Tar burnt, 32 lives lost, it was 33. But it was big news, right? Like I said, shipwrecks are news everywhere, but this one was special because there was a circus on board. Captain Reed, like I said, was hailed a hero. He was given a purse of like $135 for his heroism that day, rescuing 45 people. He did do an inquiry. He was quite classy about it, I will say. I have no blame to attach to anyone as regards to the fire. I think it was a pure accident. He has so this is his grave in St. John. I went to the cemetery in St. John, and I said, hey, I'm looking for this guy's grave. It was way in the back of the cemetery, and some guy took me out there in the golf cart. So I acknowledge that in my book. But he has this horrible story with his when he finally got back to St. John, he learned that his youngest son, William, had died on the same day the World Tar sank. And it was very sudden, it came on out of nowhere, so they think it was cholera. They think he was struck by cholera. Captain Reed was given captainship of another boat and sailed that for a while. Then he eventually became harbor master on St. John, in St. John. And he would walk up and down those docks that we saw with his dog and just do whatever harbor masters do. So he had quite the life. 16 left.
Oh, good one, yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
Nothing ever was said. There was no mention of it. People just let it go. There was no boat that was ever found. Nobody ever admitted. Nobody knew who they were. They just disappeared.
I would like that.
It was not. I would not happen today. I was just gonna say that was a very, very different time. Harrison, remember the kid that was going to Ottawa, and a couple of other old guys. They would get together every year in St. John to commemorate the sinking of the World Tar, which is kind of cool to think of these guys up there having coffee in a diner talking about the World Tar. Harrison was the last one to pass away. He did it right before the anniversary of the 60th year anniversary of the sinking of the World Tar. The World Tar was replaced by a boat called the Gazelle. It was such a good idea. Like the concept was good to have this essentially a ferry boat up and down the East Coast from Canada down to Portland. It was a really, it was a lucrative passage, even though World Tar only made it from June until October. So they replaced her with the Gazelle, which then wrecked on a bunch of rocks. Nobody was killed. It was fine, but shortly after it was put in the surface, it wrecked. So they kind of abandoned the whole plan to have this ferry, and that was it. Excuse me, this is Penobscot Bay, and that's Vinyl Haven. And right about there is where the World Tar met her untimely death, and all those people died in that cold October day. So this is a cool story. Years later, this guy, Reverend Avery, was talking to a reporter, and he said, I've kept this a secret until this very minute that I tell him this. So after the World Tar sank in 1836, it became a thing of legend. And on Vinyl Haven, people would say they saw the ghost of the World Tar, and the old women would say you could hear the elephant trumpeting out in the waters, or you could hear the lion roar. And so in like the 20s, almost 100 years later, boys would take their girlfriends up to the point where it overlooked the bay and kind of be like, those stories, you don't get to snuggle up to them.
Yeah.
Well, one day, Avery, when he was about 17, he and one of his buddies said, no, we're gonna go find that ghost of that boat. And so they had seen lights out in the harbor. And so in the middle of the night, at 2 a.m., they got in the boat and they started chasing the lights. Because they're like, we're gonna have one heck of a story if we see the ghost of the World Tar. So they would row all they could. They'd row over there where the lights were, and the light would be gone. And then all of a sudden the light would appear over there. So they'd row really hard, go over there. They chased that light around the bay for hours. And finally they gave up. And they go back to dock. And there was an old fisherman that was pulling up to the dock at about the same time. And the fisherman's like, oh, what are you boys doing out here? And they didn't want to tell him what they were doing. And so the old guy asked them back to his hut or whatever for donuts and coffee. And they said, well, sir, what are you doing out here? And he said, well, I'm a herring fisherman. And what I do is when I go out, I light a light, all the fish come to me, I douse the light, and then I go over there. and I light the light again, and the fish comes to me and I catch them, and I douse it, and I go over here. They had chased this herring fisherman all around Penobscot Bay for hours, thinking it was the ghost of the World Tar. And those boys didn't tell a soul about how dumb they felt until years and years later. So the point is, the ghost of the World Tar lives up there still. And this is the story that does not go away. All right, you said, Warren, that you know the guy from Schooner Fair.
Yes.
So there's a folk song about the World Tar. There is a beer. The Sebago Brewing Company has a World Tar beer, and I asked if I could use their art. And they gave me some of the stout, and I gave them one of my books. And so we have this little thing back and forth. But there's that. There is a children's book about it. There are podcasts about it. It's a story that doesn't go away, which is kind of cool. I got one more thought for us, all right, and that's about Mogul. You pointed out that he was chained to the deck, but he jumped over. No one ever found his body. There were rumors that an elephant washed up on Brimstone Island, and there are rumors that they found this. Nothing I could, prove any of it. These right here are bones that were displayed in vinyl media. The bones no longer exist. I don't know what happened to them. They don't know what happened. All that's left is this photograph. I've asked some people, and they think maybe it might look like a whale bone. I don't know. But my theory is that's Mogul's leg bone. Yeah, all right. Mogul, who was chained to the deck, he jumped off, removing his leg from the rest of his body. His legs stayed behind. The bones floated onto the shore. We had a three-legged elephant that was floating around, swimming away into Europe, wherever, finding another island to hunger down.
If you look at it, that could be like a foot of an elephant's foot.
See?
Bigger one, yeah. I can see.
Thank you. Exactly. And so that's my theory, and I'm holding to it. So
Yeah,
I think he survived.
well, wouldn't he have been bleeding heavily? I mean, that's the problem.
Look at seawater. And he didn't have to go that far.
Yeah.
No. My theory works. Don't go too much.
Okay.
So I think he made it, and that's how I see it. So there you have it. Thank you for your participation.
I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed it. That was good. You told it very well.
Thank you.
Yeah, we
What
could
I
play.
read and from when I saw the thing on the TV show, everything kind of matched up.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because like you were talking, I had so many questions.
What are they?
Well, it was just about like, just some of the, so something like when I read stuff like this, I like to know like, when something like this happens afterwards, what is put in place? What kind of laws are put in place? What kind of inspections are put in place? Like it was wooden. I mean, stuff like this, like when you talk about like, cause the boat was wooden, right?
Yep.
So it's just like the trees they use out in Canada, cause it burned, the boat burned for such a long time. It's just like, what kind of tree was it? Like, getting off topic here.
That's right.
Yeah, like what kind of regulations are put in place? That always sticks in my mind. Like, what do they do so stuff like this doesn't happen again? Even though in 2011, the Titanic.
Right. 1912. Yeah. So
I said 2000. Yeah,
you did, but I know what you meant. I would love to tell you that there were all sorts of changes that happened because of this, but there weren't. It was a time, I think the technology and the building and the expansion was happening so quickly.
Yeah.
That there was just, people were just doing, and I think throughout time, things started to, they probably looked at these, but it was years, decades before real regulations started.
Do you think people would just accept that like tragedies like this are going to happen?
And if you decide to travel by boat rather than overland,
Yeah.
you're facing, that comes hand in hand with it. And boats were, like I said, crashing all the time. The only reason we know about this one is because there was a circus.
and it was in the excitement of it went 15 minutes. So they were like, wow, this is great.
Yes.
Yeah.
That I wanted to find and this happened as a result, and there really wasn't.
Yeah, and then I think when you talk about the year and the animals, I'm like, okay, well, P.T. Barnum was really popular as like a circus guy, but he did say that there are a bunch of circuses all over the place.
And he started the P.T. Barnum phenomenon started about 20 years later. So, but I mean, 1836 was a long time ago,
Yeah.
so it was about 1850s-ish, I think that started going, so, and then you got the big top and all that sort of thing, but this was a relatively new thing, these traveling circuses in 1836, but we were getting there to the big top.
Yeah, and I think some people are just so excited about the sense of adventure, like, wow, another way to travel to see other places, so.
You definitely, these immigrants that come over, they've taken the ultimate, ride from Ireland to Canada. And like, well, we can take a 3-day boat ride to Portland.
Yeah,
So people did have to be more adventurous at that point in time and just hunker down and accept what their fate may be.
So how did they get the animals for the,
They poached them.
okay,
They were poached and then brought over on boats and then sold and distributed amongst.
so it wasn't people from the circus, it was poachers who were then selling the circuses? or-
Sometimes they would, it happened both ways. People from the circus might be, we want a rat, and then a poacher would deliberately go do it, or poachers are like, I got 3 giraffes, a rhinoceros, and an elephant. So it went both ways.
Okay,
But the poaching stories, I got in the book, they're horrible. Just
yeah,
awful.
I can,
Just off.
I've heard poaching stories and they're
Yeah,
never
and it was,
pretty.
and it was so long ago, and such bad treatment of
Yeah.
everybody, the guides and the animals and everything. It was just not a good part of the book. This is the good part of the book. So no, that's true. Well, cool, thank you, and
We can play the Schooner Fair song to end it, if you think that would be a good way to.
thanks, guys. Where did it?
Oh, that's true. Where did Emmett go?
Said he had class.
Yeah, class, gotcha. All right, well, thanks, guys.
Bye.
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 Hi, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.